I can't
Okay.
breathe right.
Put your hands on the wheel. Stop moving.
Something's wrong. I need an ambulance.
Step out of the car right now.
I'm having a heart attack.
Turn around. Hands behind your back.
The AXON body camera footage showed Officer Robert Rogers walking up to a black Mercedes sedan at 10:45 p.m. on a quiet suburban road. What the camera would record in the next 6 minutes would end his career, spark federal criminal charges, and expose a truth that would cost the city $8.5 million. The man in that Mercedes was Marcus Hale, a 58-year-old respected community figure and father of 3. Officer Rogers had no idea that the driver was in the middle of a massive heart attack, and what Rogers did next, captured in high-definition video and audio, would become one of the most watched and debated police body camera recordings in the country. If you are ready to see injustice and institutional racism taken down in our society, like this video and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. And if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now, because you won't want to miss tomorrow's story of cops messing with the wrong people and finding out. Let's continue. Marcus Hale had lived in the city for 32 years. He had worked his way up from entry-level positions to senior management at a regional logistics firm, quietly building a reputation as someone who gave back more than he took. He volunteered with the youth programs, sat on nonprofit boards, and showed up when the community needed steady hands. That night, he was driving home from a late strategy meeting at his company's distribution center on the east side. He was wearing dark slacks and a navy pullover, no uniform, no visible identification. Just a man driving home in his personal vehicle after a 12-hour workday. What no one in that car or on that roadside could see was the crushing pressure building in his chest, the radiating pain shooting down his left arm, and the confusion creeping into his thoughts as his heart muscle began to die. Officer Robert Rogers was 29 years old and had been on the force for 4 years. He worked the night shift and had developed a reputation, among other officers, for being aggressive during stops. He had 3 complaints on his record for excessive use of force, but all had been cleared after internal review. 2 other incidents had been reported by citizens, but never formally logged due to complicated intake procedures that discouraged follow-through. Rogers saw the black Mercedes change lanes without signaling and decided to pull it over. Marcus saw the lights behind him and pulled over immediately onto the shoulder. He was not worried at first, despite the growing tightness in his chest that he assumed was stress or indigestion from the working dinner. He turned off his engine, rolled down his window, and tried to place both hands on the steering wheel. His left arm felt heavy and strange. Sweat was beginning to soak through his shirt collar. He did not reach for his wallet. He waited for the officer to approach, focusing on controlling his breathing through the discomfort. Rogers' body camera showed him walking up to the driver's side window with his flashlight cutting through the darkness. Marcus turned his head slowly to look at the officer, his face glistening with perspiration under the beam. Rogers asked for license and registration. Marcus opened his mouth to respond, but his words came out slurred and weak. He told the officer that his chest hurt, that something was wrong, that he needed help. The sentences broke apart as he spoke them. Rogers heard the slurred speech and saw the sweating face and the slow, uncoordinated movements. He interpreted these signs not as medical distress but as possible intoxication or an attempt to avoid compliance. Rogers told Marcus to keep his hands visible and asked again for his documents. Marcus fumbled toward his wallet with trembling fingers, his right hand clutching his chest. He managed to pull out his license and reach toward the glove box for the registration, but his movements were sluggish and uncertain. Sharp pain was radiating through his jaw now, his vision blurred at the edges. He handed the documents to Rogers with a shaking hand and whispered again that he needed medical assistance. Rogers took the license and registration without acknowledging the request. He walked back to his patrol car to run the information. The computer screen displayed Marcus Hale's name, address, and clean driving record. Nothing unusual. Nothing that would flag special attention. Rogers scrolled through the information quickly, his mind already moving to the next phase of the stop. He saw a middle-aged man in an expensive car showing signs of impairment on a weeknight. The details suggested a routine DUI stop. He closed the computer window and walked back to the Mercedes. Rogers told Marcus that he had failed to signal when changing lanes. Marcus nodded weakly, barely able to process the words. Rogers then asked where he was coming from. Marcus said he had been at a work meeting. Rogers asked what kind of work. Marcus struggled to form the words, saying something about logistics and planning. His speech was becoming more labored. The pain in his chest was intensifying to the point where he could barely focus. Rogers heard vague answers and saw continued signs of what he believed was impairment. He made his decision. Rogers told Marcus to step out of the vehicle. Marcus, through a fog of pain, asked why. It was a question born of confusion and desperation, not defiance. Failing to signal a lane change did not require exiting the vehicle. But Rogers repeated the command more firmly, his tone hardening. Marcus tried to comply. He opened the door and attempted to stand, but his legs were unsteady. The world tilted. He was 58 years old, solidly built but weakening by the second. Rogers was younger, shorter, and operating on adrenaline and assumption. The body camera showed Marcus standing beside his car, one hand pressed against his chest, the other gripping the doctor frame for balance. Rogers told him to turn around and place his hands on the vehicle. Marcus asked again what this was about, his voice barely above a whisper. He said he needed an ambulance. Rogers did not answer the question. He grabbed Marcus's arm and spun him around to face the car. Marcus did not resist, but his body moved slowly, heavily, as if dragging through water. Rogers told him to stop tensing up. Marcus said he was not tensing up, that he was in pain. His voice carried an edge now, desperation breaking through. Rogers took this as resistance. He grabbed both of Marcus's arms and tried to pull them behind his back. Marcus instinctively pulled back slightly, not to fight, but because the sudden rough contact sent another wave of agony through his chest and shoulder. Rogers immediately escalated. He swept Marcus's legs out from under him. The sound of Marcus hitting the pavement was sickening. It was a wet, heavy impact that the Bodycam microphone captured in full clarity. His right shoulder took most of the collision. Then his head snapped to the side and struck the asphalt with a dull crack. The body camera showed Marcus lying face down on the cold ground, completely still for several seconds. His breathing was rapid and shallow. Rogers pressed his knee into Marcus's back and wrenched both arms behind him, pulling them up sharply. He slapped handcuffs on Marcus's wrists, the metal biting into skin. Marcus's face was turned to the side, his eyes half closed, his lips moving soundlessly. A thin line of blood began to run from his nose. His chest rose and fell in desperate, irregular gasps. Rogers was breathing hard, adrenaline surging. He called into his radio that he had a non-compliant suspect in custody who had resisted commands. The words were a lie, but they flowed easily. The video showed something entirely different. Rogers pulled Marcus to his feet. Marcus's legs buckled. He could barely stand. The front of his pullover was torn and covered in dirt and asphalt grit. Blood dripped from his face onto his chest. Rogers walked him to the patrol car and placed him in the back seat. Marcus said nothing. He was too far gone, the pain and confusion overwhelming everything else. Rogers walked back to the Mercedes with his flashlight, scanning the interior for anything suspicious. Nothing. Just a clean vehicle with some papers on the passenger seat and a briefcase in the back. He shined his light around the cabin, opened the glove box again, checked under the seats. Everything was ordinary. He returned to his patrol car and radioed for backup. still describing the situation as a traffic stop with a resistant driver. He made no mention of the chest pain. He made no call for medical assistance. 4 minutes passed. Marcus sat in the back seat of the patrol car, his breathing becoming more labored, more erratic. His skin was turning pale, his lips were taking on a bluish tint. The pain in his chest was no longer sharp. It was crushing, all-consuming, spreading through his torso like fire. His vision darkened at the edges. He tried to speak, but could not form words. His body was shutting down. Backup arrived 6 minutes after the initial stop. 2 more patrol cars pulled up, their lights cutting through the night. Officers stepped out and approached Rogers, asking what he had. Rogers gestured toward the back seat and began to explain the stop. One of the officers walked over to the patrol car and looked in at Marcus. The officer's expression changed immediately. He called out to Rogers, asking if Marcus was okay. Rogers said the suspect had been acting strange and resistant. The officer opened the back door and looked more closely. Marcus was slumped against the seat, his breathing shallow and rapid, his eyes barely open. The officer yelled for Rogers to call an ambulance immediately. Rogers hesitated for a fraction of a second, then reached for his radio. He called for medical assistance, giving the location but offering no details about the patient's condition. The dispatcher asked for more information. Rogers said it was urgent and nothing more. Paramedics arrived 8 minutes later. 8 critical minutes, during which Marcus Hale's heart struggled and failed. By the time the ambulance pulled up, Marcus had gone into full cardiac arrest. The paramedics moved quickly, pulling him from the back seat onto a stretcher, starting chest compressions, attaching monitors, inserting an IV line. The Bodycam recorded every second, the frantic movements, the medical equipment scattered across the pavement, the rhythm of compressions, the electronic beep of the defibrillator charging, the shock delivered to Marcus's chest. Rogers stood to the side, watching, his face pale in the flashing lights. The ambulance doors closed. The siren wailed as it pulled away. The scene fell quiet except for the crackling of police radios. Rogers stood alone beside his patrol car, the Bodycam still recording, the weight of what had just happened beginning to settle onto his shoulders. He did not yet know that Marcus Hale would survive. But barely. He did not yet know about the permanent heart damage, the brain injury from oxygen deprivation, the lifelong disabilities that would follow. He did not yet know that every second of this stop had been recorded in perfect clarity. All he knew was that something had gone very, very wrong. Marcus Hale was stabilized in the intensive care unit at County General Hospital, just after 2 in the morning. The cardiac team had worked for 47 minutes to restart his heart and maintain circulation. The diagnosis came quickly. Massive myocardial infarction with prolonged oxygen deprivation to the brain. The cardiologist documented extensive damage to the left ventricle. The neurologist noted cognitive impairment consistent with anoxic brain injury. The prognosis was grim. Marcus would survive, but he would not be the same. The medical team photographed every injury. The bruising on his wrists from the handcuffs, the contusions on his shoulder and back, the laceration on his scalp where his head had struck the pavement, the swelling around his nose. Every detail was recorded in the medical file with timestamps and clinical descriptions that would later become evidence. Marcus's wife arrived at the hospital at 3:15 in the morning after receiving the call from the emergency department. Their 3 adult children arrived within the hour, driving through the night from neighboring cities. They stood in the ICU waiting room as doctors explained the extent of the damage. Permanent heart failure. Likely, permanent cognitive deficits affecting memory and executive function. Possible mobility limitations. The family listened in numb silence. Marcus had left for work that morning, healthy and capable. He was returning home in a hospital bed, his future rewritten by 6 minutes on a roadside. The police department's internal affairs division received notification of the incident before dawn. By 6 in the morning, 2 investigators were reviewing the bodycam footage in a secure viewing room. They watched Officer Rogers approach the vehicle. They heard Marcus's first plea for help. They saw Rogers ignore it. They watched the escalation, the dragging, the impact against the asphalt, the handcuffing of a man clearly in medical distress. They saw Rogers search the car while Marcus lay gasping on the ground. They heard Rogers call in a resistant suspect. They watched backup arrive and finally, belatedly, call for medical assistance. The investigators watched the footage twice in complete silence. When it ended, they looked at each other and understood immediately that this was catastrophic. Rogers was called in for an interview at 9 in the morning. He arrived in civilian clothes, his face drawn and tired. He sat across from 2 internal affairs investigators and a union representative. The investigators asked him to describe the stop in his own words. Rogers said he had pulled over a vehicle for a traffic violation. He said the driver appeared impaired, slurring his words and moving slowly. He said he ordered the driver out of the vehicle for a field sobriety assessment. He said the driver became uncooperative and pulled away when Rogers attempted to detain him. He said he used necessary force to gain compliance. He said he called for backup and then medical assistance when the situation was under control. The investigators asked if he remembered the driver saying anything about chest pain. Rogers hesitated. He said the driver had mentioned something about not feeling well, but it seemed like an excuse to avoid the stop. The investigators asked if Rogers had considered that the driver might actually be experiencing a medical emergency. Rogers said he had assessed the situation and determined it was more likely a case of impairment. The investigators asked why he had not called for medical assistance immediately. When the driver mentioned chest pain, Rogers said he had to secure the scene first. The investigators asked how long it took to secure a single unarmed man already handcuffed in the back of a patrol car. Rogers had no good answer. The interview lasted 90 minutes. At the end, the investigators informed Rogers that he was suspended immediately with pay pending the outcome of the investigation. They took his badge and his service weapon. They told him not to discuss the case with anyone and not to contact Marcus Hale or his family. Rogers nodded and left the building. He knew his career was in serious jeopardy. What he did not yet know was that the footage was about to become public. Marcus's family hired a civil rights attorney within 48 hours of the incident. The attorney filed a public records request for the bodycam footage immediately. The police department initially resisted, citing the ongoing internal investigation. The attorney filed a motion. In court, local media picked up the story. The headlines were immediate and damning. Man suffers heart attack during traffic stop. Officer accused of using excessive force. Pressure built quickly. Civil rights organizations issued statements demanding transparency and accountability. Community leaders called for the footage to be released. The police chief, facing mounting public scrutiny, made the decision 5 days after the incident to release the video. The bodycam footage was posted on the department's website and sent to local news stations on a Friday afternoon. It went viral within hours. Millions of people watched Officer Rogers ignore Marcus Hale's pleas for help, watched him drag a man in medical crisis from his vehicle, watched him handcuff and restrain someone actively having a heart attack, watched him search a car while a human being deteriorated on the pavement behind him. The comment sections filled with outrage. Social media platforms amplified the video. National news networks picked it up. By Saturday morning, Marcus Hale's name and face were known across the country. The reactions came in waves. Medical professionals pointed out the classic signs of cardiac distress that Rogers had missed or dismissed. The chest pain, the profuse sweating, the labored breathing, the altered speech patterns. They noted that these symptoms are often misinterpreted in Black patients, particularly by individuals without adequate medical training. Civil rights advocates highlighted the broader pattern. A routine traffic stop for a minor violation, escalating into life-threatening force. Legal analysts discussed the implications for police liability and the likelihood of significant civil damages. The footage became a focal point in ongoing national conversations about police training, use of force protocols, and racial disparities in how distress signals are interpreted and acted upon during law enforcement encounters. As the Bodycam footage spread rapidly online, sparking heated discussions across social media and news outlets, many wondered whether the outcome might have differed with quicker recognition of the distress signals. Would you have called for an ambulance the moment the driver mentioned chest pain? Type yes or no in the comments below and share why you believe officers need better training to handle situations like this. The police department issued a statement acknowledging the incident and confirming the ongoing investigation. The statement was carefully worded and said little of substance. It did not satisfy anyone. Community groups organized protests outside City Hall and the police headquarters. They carried signs with Marcus's face and phrases like "heart attacks are not crimes" and "medical emergency, not resisted arrest." The protests remained peaceful but persistent. Local elected officials began calling for accountability and reform. The mayor met privately with Marcus's family and promised a thorough and transparent investigation. The internal affairs investigation concluded 2 weeks after the incident. The findings were unambiguous. Rogers had violated multiple department policies: failure to recognize and respond to a medical emergency, use of excessive force without justification, failure to de-escalate the situation, failure to call for medical assistance in a timely manner, and filing a false report by characterizing Marcus as a resistant suspect when the video clearly showed otherwise. The recommendation was termination for cause. The police chief accepted the recommendation. Rogers was fired 3 weeks after the traffic stop. But termination was not the end. The district attorney's office had been reviewing the case simultaneously. Prosecutors watched the Bodycam footage and consulted with medical experts about the severity and permanence of Marcus's injuries. They reviewed Rogers's prior complaints and the pattern of aggressive behavior. They considered the legal standards for criminal charges against law enforcement officers. The decision came 26 days after the incident. Rogers would face criminal charges: 3 counts: assault under color of law, deprivation of civil rights through excessive force, and reckless endangerment resulting in serious bodily injury. Rogers was arrested at his home on a Tuesday morning. News cameras captured him being led out in handcuffs, the same handcuffs he had placed on Marcus Hale 3 weeks earlier. He posted bail and was released pending trial. His attorney issued a statement saying Rogers had acted in good faith based on his training and experience, that he had perceived a threat, and that the tragic outcome was not the result of criminal intent. The statement rang hollow against the backdrop of the Bodycam video, playing on loop across every news channel. Marcus's family, represented by their attorney, filed a federal civil rights lawsuit against Rogers and the city 32 days after the traffic stop. The complaint ran 47 pages. It detailed every second of the encounter. It cited Marcus's permanent injuries and disabilities. It presented evidence of inadequate police training on medical emergency recognition. It documented patterns of excessive force complaints that had been inadequately addressed. It alleged that the city's failure to properly train and supervise officers created an environment where incidents like this were not only possible, but predictable. The lawsuit demanded compensatory and punitive damages, though no specific amount was listed initially. The case was assigned to federal court and scheduled for discovery. Media attention remained intense. National civil rights organizations added Marcus's case to their ongoing campaigns for police reform. His story was featured in documentaries about law enforcement accountability. Medical journals published articles using his case as an example of the dangers of misinterpreting cardiac symptoms. Law enforcement training programs began incorporating the Bodycam footage as a teaching tool, showing exactly what not to do during a traffic stop. Marcus Hale, a man who had lived quietly and worked steadily for decades, became a national symbol of something much larger than himself. The case moved forward on parallel tracks: criminal prosecution of Rogers and the civil lawsuit against Rogers and the city. Both would take months to resolve, but the outcome was already shaping policy discussions and reform efforts across the country. The civil lawsuit entered the discovery phase 4 months after the traffic stop. Attorneys for Marcus's family subpoenaed department records, training materials, use of force policies, and personnel files. They deposed officers, supervisors, and training instructors. They hired medical experts to testify about cardiac care and brain injury. They hired law enforcement experts to evaluate Rogers' actions against national standards. The city's attorneys fought to limit the scope of discovery, but the federal judge overseeing the case allowed most of the requested materials to proceed. It was during this phase, deep in the examination of financial records and philanthropic registrations, that the hidden truth about Marcus Hale began to emerge. The city's attorneys were reviewing potential character evidence and community impact statements when they discovered a pattern of anonymous donations to municipal programs spanning more than 15 years. Large sums carefully structured through a private foundation, directed specifically toward police department initiatives. The amounts were staggering, nearly $4 million over the course of a decade and a half. The donations had funded proposals for officer wellness programs, mental health resources, and, crucially, specialized medical emergency recognition training for patrol officers. Every proposal had been submitted to the city council and police administration with detailed implementation plans and offered funding. Every single proposal had been shelved or rejected due to budget priorities, administrative resistance, or simple bureaucratic inertia. The foundation's board was small and discreet. The primary benefactor was listed under a trust structure that required legal effort to pierce. When the city's attorneys finally traced the money to its source, they found themselves staring at Marcus Hale's name. The man whose life they were now defending their client against having nearly ended was the same man who had been quietly trying to prevent exactly this kind of tragedy for over a decade. The irony was devastating. The liability implications were catastrophic. Rogers' defense team learned of the revelation during a mandatory disclosure conference. Their strategy had been built around portraying the incident as a split-second decision made under pressure by an officer doing his best with limited training. That strategy evaporated the moment they understood that their client had violently dragged and nearly killed the very person whose hidden resources had been attempting to give officers like Rogers the training that might have saved both their lives that night. The optics were indefensible. Settlement discussions began immediately, but Marcus's family was not interested in a quiet resolution. They wanted the truth on public record. They wanted a jury to see the full scope of what had happened, not just the Bodycam violence, but the systemic failure, the ignored opportunities, the man whose quiet generosity had been met with bureaucratic indifference until it nearly cost him everything. The case proceeded to trial. The criminal case against Rogers concluded first. The trial lasted 8 days. The prosecution presented the Bodycam footage on the first day, playing it in full for the jury. They called the paramedics who had responded to the scene, who testified about finding Marcus in full cardiac arrest. They called the emergency room physicians who had fought to save his life. They called the cardiologist who described the permanent damage to his heart. They called the neurologist who detailed the cognitive impairments that would affect Marcus for the rest of his life. They presented expert testimony from a law enforcement trainer who walked through every moment where Rogers should have recognized medical distress and should have called for help. The expert testimony was clinical and damning. Rogers' defense attempted to argue that he had feared for his safety during the encounter, that Marcus's slow movements and slurred speech could have indicated a threat rather than a medical crisis. The prosecutor dismantled this argument methodically. She asked the defense's use of force expert to identify any moment in the video where Marcus made a threatening gesture. There was none. She asked when exactly Rogers had articulated fearing for his safety in his initial radio call. He had not. She asked why, if Rogers had genuinely feared a threat, he had left Marcus handcuffed and unmonitored in the back of a patrol car while he searched the vehicle. The expert had no satisfactory answer. The defense case collapsed under the weight of the video evidence and the medical testimony. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. They returned guilty verdicts on all 3 counts. Rogers sat motionless as the verdicts were read. Sentencing was scheduled for 4 weeks later. At sentencing, the judge addressed Rogers directly. He said that police officers are entrusted with extraordinary authority and responsibility. When they abuse that authority, particularly when they ignore clear signs of medical distress and use violence against someone in crisis, they betray not only the individual they harm but the entire community they are sworn to protect. The fact that Marcus had complied with every instruction and had explicitly asked for medical help made the violation even more egregious. Rogers was sentenced to 4 years in prison with eligibility for parole after 2 years. His law enforcement certification was permanently revoked. He would never work as a police officer again. The civil trial began 6 weeks after the criminal sentencing. The jury selection took 3 days. The plaintiff's attorneys wanted jurors who could understand both the immediate violence of the traffic stop and the deeper betrayal of the ignored philanthropic efforts. The trial itself lasted 12 days. The Bodycam footage was played again. The medical experts testified again. But this trial also included new evidence: the financial records showing Marcus's anonymous donations, the rejected proposals for medical emergency training, the city emails discussing budget priorities that had deprioritized exactly the kind of training that might have prevented this incident. The revelation about Marcus's hidden philanthropy landed like a bombshell in the courtroom. Spectators gasped audibly when the attorney projected the donation records onto the screen. City officials sitting in the gallery visibly paled as they realized the full extent of the failure. Rogers, present in civilian clothes as a defendant in the civil case, stared at the floor. The jury watched in silence as the plaintiff's attorney walked through each rejected proposal. Each offered donation. Each missed opportunity. Then the attorney asked the question that would define the entire case. If the city had accepted Marcus Hale's generous offers to fund the very training that could have saved his life, would we be here today? Marcus testified on the 10th day of the trial. He walked slowly to the witness stand, his movements still affected by the physical therapy he would require for the foreseeable future. His speech was slightly halting, a permanent effect of the brain injury. He described his work history, his family, his commitment to the community. He described the night of the traffic stop as he remembered it, the crushing pain in his chest, the desperate attempts to communicate his distress, the terror of being dragged from the car, the helplessness of lying on the pavement, unable to breathe while Rogers ignored him. He described waking up in the hospital days later, unable to recognize his own children at first, unable to remember basic information, his body failing him in ways it never had before. Then the attorney asked him about the donations. Marcus explained that he had built a successful career and accumulated wealth quietly. He said he had always believed that those who had resources had an obligation to use them to make their communities safer and stronger. He said he had specifically focused on police wellness and medical training because he had seen too many encounters where officers seemed overwhelmed or undertrained, and he had wanted to help. He said he had made the donations anonymously because he had not wanted recognition or influence. He had simply wanted the programs to exist. He said he had never imagined that he would one day become a statistic in the very problem he had been trying to solve. The defense tried to argue that the city's rejection of the training proposals was a matter of administrative discretion, not negligence. The plaintiff's attorneys countered by presenting internal emails showing that administrators had acknowledged the value of the programs, but had simply chosen to prioritize other budget items. They presented testimony from current officers who said they had never received any formal training on recognizing cardiac emergencies during traffic stops. They presented national standards showing that such training was increasingly considered essential. The city's defense, like Rogers's criminal defense before it, crumbled under the accumulated weight of the evidence. The jury deliberated for 2 days. They returned with a verdict awarding Marcus's family $8,500,000. The breakdown included $2 million for past and future medical expenses, $1 million for lost wages and diminished earning capacity, $3 million for pain and suffering, and $2.5 million in punitive damages against both Rogers and the city. The punitive damages portion included a specific finding that the city's failure to implement adequate medical emergency training despite being offered funding to do so constituted reckless indifference to the constitutional rights of its citizens. It was one of the largest civil rights settlements in the city's history. Marcus used a significant portion of the settlement to do what he had been trying to do for 15 years: force meaningful reform. Working with civil rights attorneys and police reform advocates, he established a new foundation that would fund mandatory medical emergency recognition training for every officer in the department. The training would be ongoing, not a one-time certification. It would include scenario-based simulations of cardiac events, stroke symptoms, diabetic emergencies, and other medical crises that might present during traffic stops. It would teach officers to prioritize calling for EMS over securing a scene when medical distress was apparent. The foundation also funded revised use of force protocols that explicitly required officers to reassess their response when a detainee reported medical symptoms. It created a simplified complaint process where citizens could file reports online, by phone, or in person without navigating bureaucratic obstacles. It established quarterly audits of use of force incidents during traffic stops, with particular attention to encounters involving medical emergencies. Every reform that had been proposed and rejected over the previous 15 years was now implemented with Marcus's money and backed by the weight of an $8.5 million verdict. Marcus himself remained largely out of the public eye during the implementation phase. His cognitive limitations made public speaking difficult. His physical stamina was diminished, but his influence was unmistakable. City officials who had ignored his anonymous proposals for years now found themselves implementing those same proposals under his name and with his direct oversight. The man they had underestimated, the man one of their officers had nearly killed on a roadside, had become the quiet architect of systemic change. Rogers served 28 months in prison before being released on parole. He gave no interviews and made no public statements. He moved to a different state and found work outside law enforcement. His life as a police officer, the identity he had built for nearly 5 years, was permanently finished. The Bodycam footage that ended his career continued to circulate in training academies and reform discussions as a definitive example of what happens when officers prioritize control over compassion and compliance over humanity. Marcus's story became a reference point in ongoing national debates about police accountability and medical emergency response. Medical schools used his case to teach future doctors about the dangers of implicit bias in diagnosing cardiac events in Black patients. Law schools used it to illustrate civil rights litigation and qualified immunity limitations. Police academies used it to demonstrate the catastrophic consequences of inadequate training and poor decision-making during routine encounters. A traffic stop that should have lasted 5 minutes had instead reshaped an entire city's approach to law enforcement. 3 years after the incident, Marcus attended the graduation ceremony for the first class of officers to complete the new medical emergency recognition training program. He sat in the audience with his family as the police chief presented certificates and spoke about the importance of seeing every person stopped, detained, or questioned as a human being first and a potential threat second. The chief acknowledged Marcus by name, thanked him for his generosity both before and after the incident, and committed to ensuring that no officer would graduate from the academy without the skills to recognize when someone needed help rather than handcuffs. Marcus stood slowly when the audience applauded, his movements still careful, his expression reserved but satisfied. He had not wanted to be a symbol or a reformer. He had wanted to live quietly and give quietly. But circumstances had forced him into visibility, and he had used that visibility to create the change he had always believed was necessary. The Bodycam footage remains accessible online, viewed now not primarily for outrage, but for education. It serves as an indelible record of what can go wrong when systems fail, when training gaps persist, when warnings go unheeded, and when the people with the power to prevent tragedies choose to look away. It also serves as a record of what can go right when a victim refuses to be silenced, when accountability is pursued through every available channel, and when someone with hidden resources finally steps into the light to demand the changes they had been quietly funding for years. Marcus Hale's story is many things: a cautionary tale, a civil rights victory, a systemic indictment, and ultimately, a testament to the idea that even the quietest voices, when given no choice but to speak, can reshape the world around them. Thank you for watching this story all the way through. If it opened your eyes or made you think differently, please share it. Stories like Marcus need to be told, and your support helps make that possible.